Get that woman off my lawn before somebody gets hurt. Lieutenant Rick Danner barked through the loudspeaker as red and blue lights flooded the quiet neighborhood. 30 officers surrounded the small brick house like it was a war zone. Rifles stayed lowered, but hands hovered close. Neighbors stood on porches in slippers and robes. Phones were already recording. Naomi Carter stepped onto her front porch slowly, wearing gray sweatpants, an old army hoodie faded from years of washing, and socks without shoes. Her dark brown skin glowed under the police lights, tired eyes squinting against the glare. One trembling hand held the screen door open. The other clutched a worn photograph against her chest. "Ma'am, place your hands where I can see them," Danner snapped. "You are obstructing an active investigation." Naomi looked at the line of officers surrounding her flower garden, her mailbox, her late husband's old truck. Then she looked at the armored vehicle parked beside the curb. Her voice stayed calm. "You brought 30 officers to a widow's home." A few neighbors exchanged glances. Somebody whispered, "Widow." Danner walked forward, chest puffed out beneath his tactical vest. White male. Early 50s. Sharp jaw. Clean haircut. The kind of man used to people stepping aside before he spoke. "Do not play victim with me," he said loudly enough for every phone camera to hear. "We received reports about illegal encrypted activity coming from this address." Naomi's grip tightened around the photo. "You mean the secure line?" Danner smirked. "Hear that?" She just admitted it. Murmurs spread through the crowd. A teenage boy across the street lowered his bicycle slowly. An elderly woman beside him crossed her arms tighter around herself. Naomi did not move. "You need federal authorization before entering this property," she said quietly. "Your warrant classification is wrong." One officer near the back frowned for half a second. Danner caught it immediately. "You see what she is doing," he called out. "Pretending she knows procedure." A few officers chuckled. Naomi's eyes drifted briefly toward one patrol car. The body cam mounted on the dashboard blinked red. "Recording." She noticed. Danner noticed her noticing. "Look at me when I am talking to you." Silence hit the street. Naomi finally raised her eyes to him. "Your perimeter is exposed on the east side," she said softly. "And your officers are standing too close together." Two cops instinctively glanced toward the east alley before stopping themselves. Danner's face hardened instantly. "Enough." He pointed toward the porch steps. "Search the house." Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, Naomi's elderly neighbor, stepped off her porch suddenly. "Lieutenant, this woman has lived here 14 years. She keeps to herself. She brings groceries to veterans down the block." "Go inside, ma'am," Danner cut her off coldly. "This does not concern civilians." Naomi spoke before Mrs. Brooks could answer. "Please go home." Mrs. Brooks looked heartbroken. "Naomi, please." The old woman slowly backed away. Another phone lifted into the air. Someone whispered, "Why would cops come like this unless she did something?" Naomi heard it. Her jaw tightened but she stayed composed. What happens when power decides somebody already looks guilty before the truth even arrives? Danner climbed the porch steps. "You people always think rules change for you," he muttered under his breath. Naomi's eyes flickered for the first time. "Pain. Not anger. Pain. The rules should apply to everyone," she answered. One younger officer approached holding a tablet. "Lieutenant, the property database is acting weird." Danner snatched it away before Naomi could see the screen. "Because federal servers bounce signals through fake channels," Naomi said quietly. The young officer looked at her sharply. Danner stepped closer immediately. "Who told you that?" Naomi said nothing. Wind rustled the small American flag tied near the porch railing. Danner noticed the faded military sticker on the old truck parked beside the house. "Your husband military?" he asked. Naomi nodded once. "Retired. Convenient." He smirked again. "People steal uniforms every day." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Naomi slowly placed the old photo into her hoodie pocket. One corner stuck out for a second. A man in uniform stood beside her in the picture. Only part of his shoulder patch was visible before she covered it again. The young officer saw it. His expression changed slightly. "Lieutenant, I said enough." Danner shoved past Naomi toward the front door. She moved instantly, not aggressive, just fast enough to block him. Several officers raised their hands toward their holsters out of instinct. The neighborhood gasped. "Step aside!" Danner shouted. Naomi's breathing stayed steady. "You are about to make a mistake you cannot undo." Danner laughed loudly for the cameras. "Hear that? Now she is threatening officers." "That is not what she said," the younger cop muttered. "Officer Miller," Danner barked, "either do your job or hand me your badge." Silence again. Naomi slowly stepped back. The front door opened wider behind her. Inside the dim hallway sat a folded American flag in a glass case. Beside it rested an old black secure phone docked on a charging stand. One officer froze when he saw it. Danner immediately slammed the door shut before the crowd could get a better look. "Search warrant active," he announced loudly. "Detain her." Two officers approached Naomi carefully. Her hands trembled for the first time as cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. Phones lifted higher across the street. Somebody started live streaming. Mrs. Brooks covered her mouth in shock. Naomi stared straight ahead while Danner turned toward the cameras like a man already celebrating victory. Then suddenly every police radio on the street crackled at once. A sharp encrypted tone cut through the night air. One dispatcher's voice came through, strained and confused. "Lieutenant Danner, headquarters says do not proceed until federal authorization confirms identity." The entire street went quiet as Danner slowly reached for his radio. The radio static still echoed across the street when Naomi Carter lowered her eyes toward the cold metal cuffs around her wrists. Phones stayed raised. Porch lights flickered across frightened faces. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, "What did she do?" Lieutenant Rick Danner grabbed the radio from his shoulder hard enough to nearly rip the cord loose. "Repeat that," he barked. Static answered first. Then the dispatcher again, more careful this time. "Headquarters requests verification before entry proceeds." Danner looked around and forced a laugh for the crowd. "Technical delay. Nothing more." Naomi said nothing. Her breathing stayed controlled, but her fingers tightened around the faded photograph still half hidden inside her hoodie pocket. Officer Miller noticed again. So did Mrs. Brooks across the street. Danner leaned closer to Naomi so the phones could not hear him clearly. "You think some government glitch saves you?" Naomi looked straight ahead. "I think rushing men with guns into the wrong home usually ends badly." Danner's jaw twitched. "Take her to the cruiser." The cold night air hit harder once the patrol car door slammed shut behind her. Outside the window, neighbors still stared. Some looked guilty now. Others looked even more suspicious. Naomi sat alone in the back seat, wrists restrained, watching reflections of spinning lights slide across the glass. Her eyes drifted to the old photo again. Her late husband Marcus smiled back from the picture in faded uniform. One corner of the image had worn soft from years of being touched. Beside him stood Naomi herself, younger then, wearing a plain navy blazer with no visible insignia. Most people would miss the detail completely. She gently folded the photo closed before anyone outside could see it. Hours earlier, before the sirens came, the house had been quiet. Naomi stood in her small kitchen wearing the same faded hoodie, carefully counting prescription pills into a weekly container. A hospital bill rested beside unpaid electric notices. Steam rose from cheap instant soup on the counter. The old secure phone dock near the hallway blinked silently once every few minutes. She ignored it. Her attention stayed on a handwritten notebook filled with dates, names, and short-coded notes. Not military codes exactly. More like reminders somebody trained to notice patterns would write for themselves. One page had a sentence circled 3 times, verify before escalation. Naomi closed the notebook quickly when her teenage nephew Eli walked in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Aunt Naomi," he said softly, "those cops online are talking about your house again." He held up his phone. A blurry neighborhood forum video showed strangers arguing in comment sections beneath her address. "People believe anything," Eli muttered angrily. Naomi took the phone gently. "Not everyone." Eli looked toward the secure phone near the hallway. "Are you finally going to answer that thing?" Naomi's face tightened slightly. "Not yet. You promised Uncle Marcus you would stop hiding." Silence settled over the kitchen. Naomi stared at the folded flag inside the glass case near the living room wall. "I promised him I would survive," she answered quietly. Back inside the cruiser, her eyes closed for a second as those words echoed again. Outside, Danner argued with dispatch near his vehicle while Officer Miller stayed unusually quiet. The younger officer kept replaying something in his head. Naomi correcting tactical spacing. Naomi knowing federal warrant classification. Naomi spotting surveillance angles without looking twice. Not normal observations. A small knock suddenly tapped the patrol window. Mrs. Brooks stood outside holding Naomi's shoes. She came out barefoot, the old woman whispered to the officer near the door. The cop hesitated before opening it slightly. Naomi accepted the shoes softly. "Thank you." Mrs. Brooks leaned closer. "I know you are not what they say." Naomi's eyes softened for the first time. "Please take Eli inside if things get worse." "Naomi, please." Mrs. Brooks nodded slowly. "If you have ever been judged before people even knew your name, you already understand the silence sitting inside that patrol car." Across the street, Officer Miller quietly approached Danner again. "Lieutenant, dispatch asked specifically about a secure communications registration tied to this address." Danner snatched the tablet from his hands. "You are overthinking this." But for 1 second, fear flashed behind his eyes. Miller noticed. Naomi noticed too through the cruiser window. Then suddenly the secure phone inside Naomi's house began ringing loud enough to echo through the open doorway. Every officer turned toward the sound instinctively. One sharp electronic tone. Then another. Danner's face lost color for half a second before he stormed toward the porch. "Nobody touched that phone," Naomi said quietly from inside the cruiser. The entire front yard seemed to pause when Officer Miller looked back at her and asked, almost under his breath, "How did you know it would ring now?" Officer Miller kept staring at Naomi Carter through the patrol car window while the secure phone rang inside her house for the 4th time. Not loudly. Calmly. Like it already expected someone to answer. Around the street, whispers kept spreading faster than facts. She hacked something. Maybe terrorism. Why else would 30 cops come? Naomi heard every word through the cracked cruiser window. Her cuffed hands rested quietly in her lap. She looked tired more than afraid. Lieutenant Rick Danner stormed across the lawn and pointed toward the porch. "Cut the landline." "Sir," another officer answered nervously, "that is not a landline." Danner snapped back instantly. "Then unplug whatever it is." The officer hesitated. Naomi finally spoke from the back seat. "If you disconnect it wrong, the signal escalates automatically." Silence hit again for half a second. Danner turned slowly toward her. "You really enjoy pretending you matter." Naomi looked at him evenly. "I enjoy people staying alive." Across the street, a teenage boy replayed the live stream on his phone. Comments flooded the screen faster than he could read them. Fraud. Federal spy. Crazy woman. One comment stopped him cold. Somebody online had zoomed into the old photograph sticking from Naomi's hoodie pocket. That patch looks military, the comment read. He glanced toward Naomi differently after that. Inside the cruiser, Naomi closed her eyes briefly. The flashing lights reflected across her face like old memories she never wanted back. She remembered another room years earlier. White walls. Steel table. Men in expensive suits arguing while she stood silent near a projector screen. Nobody looking at her until she spoke. Nobody believing her until she was right. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Back on the lawn, Mrs. Brooks quietly carried Eli inside her house away from the cameras. The boy looked terrified. "They are treating her like a criminal," he whispered. Mrs. Brooks nodded sadly. "People trust uniforms faster than truth." A loud buzz suddenly came from Officer Miller's tablet. He frowned at the screen. "Lieutenant, the warrant file just flagged restricted." Danner grabbed it instantly. "Give me that." Miller hesitated this time. "Sir, somebody from D.C. is requesting direct review." "You are not paid to think," Danner hissed. Naomi watched carefully through the glass. "Not panic. Calculation." Danner noticed her watching and walked straight to the cruiser. "You think this makes you important?" he asked coldly. Naomi answered softly. "No. Dangerous mistakes make everyone important." Danner smirked for the cameras still recording nearby. "Listen carefully. The whole city already thinks you are guilty." He gestured toward the phones filming her. "Nobody cares about your side anymore." Naomi glanced toward the crowd. A few neighbors looked away when their eyes met hers. Others stared harder. Judgment felt easier when somebody else wore handcuffs. The cruiser door suddenly opened again. Officer Miller crouched slightly beside her. "Ma'am, where did you learn Federal Perimeter Protocol?" Danner barked instantly from behind him. "Miller." The younger officer ignored him for one dangerous second. Naomi studied Miller quietly before answering. "Some lessons cost people their families." Miller's expression shifted. Danner slammed the cruiser door shut again before another word could be spoken. Public humiliation always looks clean from a distance. A woman in cuffs. Officers with badges. Flashing lights. Most people never ask what happened before the cameras started rolling. Near the porch, one officer finally stepped inside the house toward the ringing secure phone. Seconds later he froze. "Lieutenant," Danner marched over impatiently. "What now?" The officer swallowed hard. "There are military commendations all over the hallway." "Old junk," Danner answered immediately. But his voice cracked slightly. Another officer emerged holding a small locked metal case. "Found this under the desk." Danner grabbed it before anyone else could inspect it. Naomi's posture changed for the first time. "Barely." But Miller noticed. "Do not open that without authorization," she said quietly. Danner laughed loudly again for the crowd. "Hear that? More fake threats." But he did not open the case. "Not yet." Eli suddenly burst back onto the porch despite Mrs. Brooks trying to stop him. "Leave her alone," he shouted. Phones turned toward the boy instantly. Danner pointed sharply. "Get him out of here." Naomi leaned forward against the cuffs. "Eli. Go inside." "They are lying about you," the boy cried. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One woman slowly lowered her phone. Officer Miller looked from Eli to Naomi, then to the unopened metal case in Danner's hands. Something stopped making sense. Then Miller's tablet buzzed again. This time the alert tone was different. Sharper. Priority encrypted. He looked down at the screen and his face drained completely. Before he could speak, Danner snatched the tablet away. But not before Miller saw one line clearly across the top of the file: authorization conflict, Pentagon oversight active. Officer Miller stared at the glowing words on the tablet like they had burned through the screen itself. Authorization conflict, Pentagon oversight active. His throat tightened. Around him, the neighborhood still buzzed with whispers and live-stream comments, but suddenly the noise felt farther away. Lieutenant Rick Danner ripped the tablet from his hands before anyone else could read the alert clearly. System glitch, Danner snapped loudly. Nothing more. Naomi Carter sat motionless in the patrol car, dark eyes fixed on the locked metal case in Danner's hand. Rain began tapping softly against the cruiser windows. Red and blue lights flashed across her face in slow waves. "You should stop touching that case," she said quietly. Danner laughed again, but weaker this time. "And why is that?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Because if the seal breaks before authorization clears, the entire chain of custody collapses." Silence. 3 officers exchanged confused looks immediately. Officer Miller blinked hard. That was not normal language. Not from a frightened civilian standing barefoot in handcuffs. Danner recovered quickly. "Anybody can memorize legal words online." Naomi answered softly, "Chain of custody is not legal language. It is procedural." One older sergeant near the porch slowly looked toward her. The way she said it sounded practiced. Automatic. Danner noticed the hesitation spreading and stepped closer to the crowd. "This woman is manipulating all of you." He pointed toward Naomi sharply. "Professional scammers study federal terminology to confuse officers." Mrs. Brooks shook her head quietly from across the lawn. "Scared people do not usually correct police procedure." Danner ignored her instantly. Nobody asked for civilian commentary. The secure phone inside the house rang again. Not frantic. Steady. Deliberate. Every officer looked toward the doorway without meaning to. Officer Miller swallowed hard. "Lieutenant, if Pentagon oversight really attached to this address, enough," Danner barked. "You either follow orders or you hand over your badge tonight." Miller fell silent, but his eyes drifted back toward Naomi again. She sat completely still despite the cuffs cutting into her wrists. No panic. No bargaining. Just exhaustion. Eli suddenly stepped onto Mrs. Brooks' porch again, voice trembling. "My aunt told you not to open that case." Danner scoffed loudly. "Your aunt also thinks she outranks police procedure." Naomi looked directly at Eli. "Inside. Now." The boy froze. Even Danner noticed something strange in her tone. Calm. Commanding. Not loud. But immediate. Eli obeyed without another word. A younger officer muttered under his breath, "She talks like command staff." Danner spun toward him. "What did you say?" "Nothing, sir." Danner's jaw tightened harder. He marched toward the porch and slammed the metal case onto a patio table. "Let us see what secret treasure scares everybody so much." Naomi leaned forward inside the cruiser instantly. "Do not force the left latch." Danner paused before he could stop himself. One heartbeat. That was all. Officer Miller noticed again. Naomi continued quietly, "It sticks under pressure." Danner glared toward her and deliberately yanked the right latch instead. Click. The case opened halfway. Inside sat stacks of sealed folders, a black encrypted drive, and a dark navy credential wallet stamped with a silver Federal eagle. Nobody spoke for a second. One officer whispered, "Jesus." Danner immediately snapped the case shut again. Fake credentials. But his voice cracked this time. Officer Miller stepped closer. Sir, federal issue wallets use silver embossing only for classified field divisions. Danner turned on him instantly. Who told you that? Miller hesitated. Training seminar last year. Naomi lowered her eyes quietly. The eagle faces left on outdated replicas, she said softly. That one does not. Another silence. This one heavier. Even the live stream phones across the street slowly lowered. Mrs. Brooks stared toward Naomi differently now. Not afraid. Confused. A police dispatcher suddenly came back across every radio again. Lieutenant Danner, stand by for direct verification request. Danner grabbed his shoulder mic hard enough to distort the sound. Negative. Situation contained. Naomi spoke before dispatch answered. You already escalated beyond containment. Danner slammed the cruiser door with his fist. Stop talking like you belong in the room. Naomi met his eyes through the rain-streaked glass. I was in rooms long before you arrived on this street. The words hit harder than shouting would have. Even Officer Miller stopped breathing for a second. Then the tablet buzzed again. Another encrypted warning flooded the screen. Miller glanced down automatically before Danner could snatch it away this time. A partially unredacted line flashed across the report for only 1 second. Special Authority Status, N. Carter, Level Sev. The screen suddenly locked itself black before the final letters appeared. The black tablet screen went dark in Officer Miller's hands, but the half-finished words stayed burned into his mind. Special Authority Status, N. Carter, Level Sev. He looked toward Naomi Carter again. Rain slid down the cruiser window between them like a barrier nobody fully understood anymore. Lieutenant Rick Danner reacted first. Anger returned to his face fast, almost desperate. Everybody back up, he ordered sharply. This scene is now restricted. Restricted by who? Mrs. Brooks asked from her porch. Danner pointed toward the crowd instantly. Anybody recording this investigation will be detained for obstruction. Several neighbors lowered their phones immediately. Fear moved through the street faster than curiosity now. Naomi watched it happen quietly. The same pattern. Power speaks loud enough, and truth starts shrinking in public. Danner opened the cruiser door suddenly and leaned inside toward her. You set this up. Naomi blinked slowly. You brought 30 officers to my house. You manipulated federal systems. Your own system warned you to stop. Danner's face hardened. Take her inside. Officer Miller hesitated. Inside where? Her living room. I want every file photographed. Naomi's eyes sharpened instantly for the first time. You do not have clearance for the study. Danner smirked coldly. And you do? Naomi stayed silent. Wrong move for Danner. The silence felt too controlled. Too certain. He grabbed her arm harder than necessary and marched her toward the house while cameras still recorded from the sidewalks. Eli stepped out again despite Mrs. Brooks pulling at his sleeve. Stop touching her like that. Danner snapped toward him instantly. One more word and Child Services gets involved. Eli froze. Naomi stopped walking. Leave the boy out of this. Then cooperate. The front hallway glowed dimly as officers entered the house. Framed military commendations lined one wall beside the folded flag. Another officer opened a closet and paused. Inside hung old Navy jackets sealed in protective plastic. No visible names. No visible rank. Just precision. Order. Dust carefully cleaned from every hanger. Looks like somebody misses playing soldier, Danner mocked loudly. Naomi's voice stayed calm behind him. Those uniforms belong to my husband. Silence touched the room for 1 second. Then Danner crushed it immediately. Convenient dead hero story. Mrs. Brooks looked disgusted from the doorway. Officer Miller quietly noticed something else instead. Every clock inside the house showed the exact same time down to the second. Military synchronization. Not decorative. Intentional. He stepped toward the secure phone dock blinking near the study entrance. Naomi spoke sharply for the first time. "Do not touch that line." Several officers looked at her instantly. Danner laughed. "There it is again. More orders." Naomi stared directly at the blinking secure terminal. "If that line escalates past verification, you lose control of this scene." "I already control this scene." Danner ripped open one folder from the metal case. Papers scattered partially across the dining table before Naomi could stop him. Officer Miller caught a glimpse. Clearance forms. Federal signatures. Blacked out sections. One phrase visible near the bottom, Joint Strategic Operations. Danner slammed the folder closed again before anyone else could read more. "Fake documents," he barked toward the room. "High-quality fakes." But nobody answered this time. Not even the officers. Naomi noticed. "You already know they are real," she said quietly. Danner pointed at her immediately. "You are under temporary federal impersonation review now." Miller frowned. "Sir, that is not an actual charge." Danner stepped toward him slowly. "You questioning command?" "No, sir." "Then stop thinking out loud." The secure phone suddenly stopped ringing. Silence swallowed the room. Naomi's face changed slightly. Not relief. Concern. Officer Miller noticed that too. Then the dock light turned solid red. One officer near the hallway whispered nervously, "What does red mean?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Escalation acknowledgement." Danner scoffed loudly. "She keeps inventing terms." Naomi looked directly at him. "You forced escalation the second you broke chain protocol." The younger officers exchanged uneasy looks again. One finally muttered under his breath, "How does she know all this?" Danner slammed another folder shut violently. "Enough. Remove every electronic device from this house." An officer reached for the secure terminal. Naomi stepped forward despite the cuffs. "Do not disconnect that manually." "Why?" the officer asked instinctively. Naomi answered softly. "Because somebody important is already on the other end." A long silence followed. Then suddenly Danner's own radio crackled alive again. This time the dispatcher's voice sounded nervous. "Lieutenant. Pentagon Command just requested live visual confirmation of the woman in custody." Every officer in the room froze. Danner slowly lowered the radio from his mouth. But Naomi noticed something else first. Sitting half-hidden beneath the scattered folders on the dining table was a dark credential card Danner had failed to fully conceal. And for one brief second before he covered it again, Officer Miller saw the Silver Eagle, and the words Level 7 Access printed beneath Naomi Carter's name. Officer Miller stared at the Silver Eagle on the credential card like his brain refused to process it. The room had gone too quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere outside, another cruiser door slammed shut. Lieutenant Danner moved first. He snatched the card off the dining table so fast the edge bent slightly in his hand. "Nobody saw that," he barked. Naomi's eyes followed the damaged corner carefully. "You just bent a restricted credential." Danner forced out a laugh that sounded thinner now. "This thing could be printed at any office supply store." "Then why are your hands shaking?" Naomi asked quietly. Several officers glanced toward Danner immediately. His grip tightened. Officer Miller stepped closer despite himself. "Sir, let me verify the serial." "No, too fast. Too sharp." Another silence hit the room. Mrs. Brooks stood near the doorway clutching Eli protectively beside her. The boy stared at the card. That bird is on the same building my dad showed me on TV once. Danner snapped toward him instantly. Kid, stay out of grown folks' business. Naomi's voice stayed calm. He only said what you already know. Danner shoved the credential halfway into his pocket. But before it disappeared fully, Miller saw another detail beneath the eagle seal. Authorized by Department of Defense. His stomach tightened. The secure terminal suddenly beeped again. One sharp tone. Then another. Red light blinking steadily now. An officer near the desk swallowed hard. Lieutenant, the system is requesting secondary authentication. Ignore it. Sir, it keeps escalating. Naomi looked toward the terminal without moving. Because the credential was scanned unofficially. Danner pointed at her angrily. You planned this entire thing. Naomi shook her head once. You forced it. Miller slowly stepped toward the terminal screen. A warning line flashed repeatedly across the monitor. Active access conflict detected. Beneath it sat a partially hidden name record. N. Carter. Clearance classification blocked. Danner moved in front of the monitor immediately. Everybody out of this room except my officers. Mrs. Brooks frowned. You dragged this woman through her own yard in front of the whole neighborhood. This is now federal interference territory. Funny, Naomi said softly. You did not believe it was federal 5 minutes ago. One younger officer near the hallway let out a nervous breath he clearly meant to hide. The tension inside the house felt heavier now. Not loud. Worse. Controlled. Like everybody suddenly realized they might already be standing inside something far above local police authority. Danner pulled Miller aside roughly. Confiscate every recording device. Even department cams. Especially department cams. Miller hesitated again. Sir, protocol says, I am your protocol tonight. Naomi closed her eyes briefly at those words. Tiny reaction. But Miller noticed. Another clue. Another mistake. On the dining table beside the scattered folders sat an old framed photo partially hidden under paperwork. Eli carefully picked it up before anyone stopped him. Naomi looked alarmed for the first time. Eli, too late. The boy turned the frame outward accidentally. A younger Naomi stood beside a group of uniformed military officials in front of the Pentagon. Most faces blurred by age. But one remained visible. A 4-star general shaking her hand. The room froze again. Danner ripped the photo from Eli's hands instantly. Old pictures do not prove anything. But this time his voice cracked slightly. Mrs. Brooks stared at Naomi differently now. Who are you? Naomi answered without looking away from Danner. Someone your lieutenant should have listened to. If you were standing in that room, what would you believe now? Was Danner hiding panic, or hiding something far worse? The secure terminal beeped again. Louder this time. Then the monitor unlocked itself without anyone touching it. Officer Miller stepped toward the glowing screen slowly. New text appeared line by line. Remote authorization accepted. Pentagon liaison requesting live response. Danner immediately lunged toward the power cable. Turn it off. Miller grabbed his wrist before he could pull it. Tiny movement. But enough to shock every officer watching. Sir, Miller said carefully, if this is real. Danner yanked his hand away violently. You think a woman living in this neighborhood outranks anybody? Naomi answered before Miller could. Rank does not disappear because paint peels off a house. Complete silence followed that sentence. Even the rain outside suddenly felt louder. Then another officer near the kitchen whispered nervously, Lieutenant. I saw that eagle before. Everybody turned toward him. He swallowed hard. On Federal Joint Command briefings. Danner's face changed instantly. Fear. Real fear this time. He pointed toward the young officer sharply. "Leave the room." "Sir, now." But before the officer moved, the secure terminal screen changed again. A live encrypted call request appeared across the monitor. Incoming authorization code scrolling beneath it faster than anyone could read. And at the bottom of the screen, directly under Naomi Carter's partially unblocked file, one line finally became fully visible. Priority status, equivalent oversight above municipal command. The blinking warning light from the secure terminal painted the living room walls red for 1 second at a time. Nobody spoke. Officer Miller still stood frozen beside the screen while Lieutenant Danner paced like a man trying to outrun panic. Naomi Carter sat quietly at the edge of the couch now, wrists finally uncuffed but still marked deep red beneath the sleeves of her worn gray sweater. Eli noticed the marks first. "They hurt you," the boy whispered. Naomi pulled her sleeves down gently. "I have had worse nights." Mrs. Brooks looked at her differently now. Not with pity anymore. With confusion. Respect. Fear, maybe. The encrypted call request continued flashing across the terminal. Danner unplugged the monitor completely this time. The screen died. But the silence stayed alive inside the room. "Everybody leaves," Danner snapped. "Now." Nobody moved immediately. That shook him more than the credential had. Naomi slowly reached for the bent federal card lying beside the old photograph. Her fingers paused over the frame instead. The picture trembled slightly in her hand. Young Naomi. Military officials. The Pentagon courtyard. Eli looked up carefully. "You were a soldier." Naomi stared at the photo for a long moment before answering. "No." Small pause. "Something harder." Danner scoffed loudly from across the room. "You expect people to believe that?" Naomi did not even look at him. "I stopped caring what people believe a long time ago." Miller watched her closely now. He noticed something nobody else had before. The edges of the photograph were worn from years of folding and unfolding. Like someone carried it constantly. Like someone could not afford to lose it. Mrs. Brooks spoke softly. "Why keep that picture?" Naomi's jaw tightened slightly. For the first time all night, pain crossed her face before she hit it again. "Because one man in that photo promised my family they would never be abandoned again." Silence. Real silence. Danner immediately cut in. "This is emotional manipulation." Naomi finally looked directly at him. Calm. Tired. Dangerous in a quiet way. "No. It is memory." The rain outside slowed. Somewhere farther down the street, neighbors still stood beyond police tape holding phones toward the house. Naomi noticed the flashing screens through the curtains. Public judgment still alive outside waiting for a villain. Or a confession. Miller stepped carefully toward the kitchen counter where scattered papers still sat. Hospital bills. Utility notices. A school lunch form with Eli's name scribbled across the top. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You live here?" Naomi nodded once. "Since my sister died." Mrs. Brooks inhaled sharply. Eli lowered his eyes. Another silence settled over the room. "Cancer," Naomi said quietly before anyone asked. 3 years ago." Her voice stayed controlled. But her hand tightened around the photograph hard enough to bend the frame backing. "She made me promise Eli would never feel abandoned." Eli moved closer beside her instantly. Small hand gripping her sleeve. "She kept the promise," he whispered. Danner rolled his eyes hard. "This changes nothing." But even he sounded less certain now. Miller looked again at the hospital bills. Then at Naomi's worn shoes near the doorway. Then at the federal credential. 2 completely different lives sitting on the same table. It did not make sense. And that frightened him more than authority did. Another officer entered from the hallway carrying a cardboard evidence box. "Lieutenant, we found this upstairs." Naomi stood immediately. First real crack in her calm all night. "Do not touch that box." Danner smiled coldly. "Now we are getting somewhere." He opened the lid slowly in front of everyone. Inside sat old notebooks, sealed envelopes, a faded service patch, and several cassette tapes stacked carefully beneath a folded dark blue uniform jacket. Miller frowned. "That patch," Naomi stepped forward before he could finish. "Leave it alone." Danner lifted the service patch between two fingers mockingly. "Looks expensive for somebody living off overdue bills." Naomi's eyes darkened instantly. "Put it down." "Mrs. Brooks noticed the stitching first. Gold thread. Pentagon insignia again. Same eagle from the credential." Eli looked terrified now. "Aunt Naomi," Danner turned toward the crowd near the doorway deliberately. "You all see this? She hid federal property inside a civilian house." Naomi answered quietly. "It was buried with my husband before you dug it back up tonight." That sentence hit the room like a physical force. Even Danner stopped moving for half a second. Miller looked back into the box slowly. Beneath the folded jacket sat one final item. A framed folded letter stamped classified release approved. Old signature visible beneath the seal. His breath caught. "Lieutenant," before he could finish, Naomi crossed the room fast and closed the box herself. Not aggressive. Protective. Like somebody shielding a grave. "Enough," she said softly. Then the phone in Danner's pocket rang. He glanced at the screen once and instantly went pale. Very pale. Miller noticed immediately. "Sir." Danner did not answer. He only stared at Naomi while the phone continued vibrating in his hand. Finally he whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "How the hell does the Pentagon know this address?" And from the dark hallway behind them, an older officer stepped forward slowly, staring at the folded uniform inside the evidence box with wide eyes before saying quietly, "I remember that patch." The older officer stepped fully into the living room, rainwater dripping from the edge of his patrol jacket onto Naomi Carter's floor. His eyes stayed locked on the folded military patch inside the evidence box. "I saw that insignia overseas," he said quietly. "Joint Command Transport Division." Lieutenant Danner cut him off immediately. "Nobody asked for story time, Harris." But Officer Harris did not move. People with that clearance did not answer to local departments. The room shifted again. Small movement. Small silence. Enough to make several officers glance at Naomi differently now. Danner straightened his uniform hard. False confidence returning piece by piece. "Enough." He pointed directly at Naomi. "This woman manipulated federal symbols to intimidate officers during an active investigation." Naomi stayed seated beside Eli. Calm. Exhausted. Still dignified. "You broke into a grieving family's home because somebody reported a black woman carrying sealed boxes." Danner ignored her completely. "Officer Miller, confiscate every item in that evidence box." Miller hesitated. "Sir, chain of command protocol says federal markings require verification before seizure." "I am verifying it." "With what authority?" That question landed harder than Miller expected. Several officers looked away immediately. Danner stepped closer to him slowly. "Do not embarrass yourself defending her." Outside, more police lights flooded the neighborhood now. Red and blue reflections slid across the windows while neighbors gathered behind barricades recording everything through phones. Naomi noticed the cameras first. Public judgment spreading street by street. Danner noticed too. And suddenly he smiled. Dangerous smile. "Good," he muttered. "Let them watch." He turned toward the doorway and raised his voice intentionally so the crowd outside could hear through the open screen door. This department does not bow to fake credentials and stolen military junk. Murmurs rose outside immediately. Somebody started live streaming louder now. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Not fear. Weariness. Eli gripped her hand harder. Aunt Naomi, look at me, she whispered softly to him. The boy obeyed instantly. Truth does not get smaller because louder people speak over it. Mrs. Brooks looked stunned hearing that. Danner rolled his eyes. Beautiful speech. Still trespassing. Still obstruction. Harris suddenly stepped closer to the evidence box again. He picked up one of the cassette tapes carefully. Handwritten date on the label. April 12th. Joint review. His expression changed slightly. Lieutenant, why would someone fake archived review recordings? Danner snatched the tape from his hand instantly. Because crazy people collect fantasies. Naomi finally stood up slowly. The entire room unconsciously stepped back half an inch. Not because she threatened them. Because she looked too calm. Do not destroy that tape, she said quietly. Or what? Danner shot back. Naomi held his stare. Or more people will ask why you are afraid of hearing it. Another silence. Sharp this time. Officer Miller glanced toward the dead terminal screen again. Then toward Danner. Then back to Naomi. Tiny doubt growing larger every second. Suddenly a dispatcher's voice crackled through Danner's radio. Lieutenant Danner, confirm status immediately. We have repeated authorization pings hitting municipal systems from federal routing channels. Danner grabbed the radio off his shoulder violently. System malfunction. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. That was your first mistake tonight. Excuse me. Treating protocol like pride. Harris looked back at Naomi carefully now. You knew those routing channels existed before dispatch said it. Naomi did not answer. But she did not need to. Eli suddenly tugged Mrs. Brooks' sleeve nervously. The picture. Everybody turned. The old photograph had slipped partly from the table onto the floor. Glass cracked slightly now. Beneath the broken frame backing sat another hidden image nobody had seen before. A younger Naomi standing beside a tall decorated officer outside the Pentagon. His face clearer this time. 4-star insignia visible. Danner froze the second he saw it. Harris inhaled sharply. That is General Everett. Miller looked between the photo and Naomi. You knew him. Naomi bent down slowly and picked up the broken frame herself. Her fingers brushed the cracked glass carefully. My husband served under him. The room fell silent again. Danner reacted too quickly. Dead men do not prove anything. Naomi looked up at him. Pain crossed her face for 1 second before she buried it again. No, she said softly. But records do. The secure terminal suddenly rebooted by itself behind them. Nobody touched it. Screen glowing back to life one line at a time. System override active. Officer Miller stared at the monitor. Then his face changed completely. Lieutenant, Danner spun toward him immediately. Do not read it. But Miller already had. Beneath Naomi Carter's partially restored file sat a flashing warning in red letters. Subject linked to fallen Joint Command Officer, Colonel Isaiah Carter. And directly underneath that line, another alert appeared. Federal Response ETA, 08 minutes. The secure terminal kept flashing Federal Response ETA, 08 minutes like a countdown nobody in the room could escape. Lieutenant Danner recovered first. Rage replaced panic fast. Dangerous rage. Everybody outside, he ordered sharply. Now. Officer Harris did not move. Neither did Miller. Danner pointed directly at Naomi. She manipulated military records to obstruct police operations. This scene is now sealed evidence. Naomi stood quietly beside the evidence box, one hand still resting over the folded uniform jacket inside. Eli clung to her sleeve. You already tore apart this house, she said softly. What else do you need? A confession. Danner stepped closer until his shadow covered her completely. Or maybe you prefer impersonation charges too. Murmurs rose outside the doorway. Neighbors still recording. Flashing lights reflecting off wet pavement. Somebody whispered, they found military stuff in her house. Another voice answered, told you something was wrong with her. Naomi heard every word. Her jaw tightened once. Nothing more. Danner turned deliberately toward the crowd outside. Public stage now. This woman has been misleading federal systems using unauthorized credentials. Eli suddenly shouted, that is a lie. Danner spun toward him instantly. Somebody remove the kid. Naomi moved in front of Eli immediately. Small movement. Fierce meaning. You do not speak to him again. You do not give orders here. Danner nodded toward two officers near the doorway. Escort her outside. Miller stepped in before they moved. Lieutenant, federal authorization already pinged the system. And until verified, she is still under municipal authority. Harris frowned. That is not how Joint Command works. Danner barked louder now, voice cracking under pressure. I said move her. One officer reluctantly reached for Naomi's arm again. Eli started crying instantly. Mrs. Brooks grabbed him protectively. The crowd outside shifted closer, phones rising higher. Naomi looked down at the officer touching her sleeve. Your body cam is still recording. The young officer froze immediately. Danner snapped toward him. Turn it off. Sir, policy says, turn it off. Tiny hope flickered across Miller's face for half a second. Then Danner walked directly to the terminal and yanked the network cable completely from the wall. The screen died again. Darkness swallowed the flashing federal warning. There, Danner muttered. Now this circus ends. Naomi watched him quietly. You just disabled an active federal relay. Silence. Sharp silence. Harris looked horrified. One officer near the doorway whispered under his breath, Jesus Christ. But Danner kept going. False victory filling him now. Search every room. Confiscate every device. Every tape. Every document. He pointed at Naomi again. And put her back in restraints. Eli broke free from Mrs. Brooks and grabbed Naomi around the waist. Please do not take her. Danner's face hardened completely. Kid, she brought this on herself. Naomi bent slightly toward Eli despite the officers surrounding her. Look at me. The boy did through tears. Fear makes loud people cruel. Do not become like them. Even one of the officers escorting her looked away after hearing that. Miller stared at Naomi's wrists as metal cuffs closed around them again. Red marks layered over older scars now visible beneath her sleeve. Not fresh scars. Old ones. Military-looking restraint damage. He noticed. Harris noticed too. Danner noticed neither. He was too busy winning. You could have walked away tonight, Danner said coldly. Instead you forced a federal stunt. Naomi answered quietly, no. You forced this the moment you forgot the law was supposed to protect people. Danner laughed harshly. Nobody is coming to save you. Then the living room television suddenly flickered alive by itself. Static first. Then grainy body cam footage appeared across the screen. Everybody froze. The camera angle shaky. Rain. Naomi standing in her yard earlier that night with both hands visible. Calm. Cooperative. Then Danner's voice from the recording clearly saying, I do not care what clearance she claims. Drag her out before Federal gets involved. Complete silence slammed into the room. Danner lunged for the television remote instantly. Too late. Another line from the recording echoed through the speakers. Delete the first 10 minutes before command reviews it. Miller slowly looked toward Danner now. Not confusion anymore. Realization. Outside, neighbors lowered phones one by one. Somebody whispered, he knew. Danner ripped the power cord from the television violently. Screen black again. But the damage stayed alive in every face around him. He pointed toward Naomi desperately now. Edited footage. All of it. No one answered immediately. Even the officers looked uncertain now. Then from outside the house came the sound of multiple black SUVs stopping hard at the curb. Doors opening in perfect sequence. Heavy footsteps moving fast through rain. Danner's face drained white. And from the front doorway, a deep voice suddenly cut through the entire house with one word. Stop. Rainwater dripped from black tactical jackets onto Naomi Carter's living room floor as 6 federal officers stepped through the doorway in complete silence. No sirens now. No shouting. Just heavy boots and the low crackle of encrypted radios. The neighbors outside stopped whispering. Phones slowly lowered. Even the flashing police lights suddenly felt smaller. The man in front wore no city badge. Dark suit. Pentagon credential clipped beneath his coat. Silver hair cut close. Calm eyes that scanned the room once before landing directly on Naomi's cuffs. Remove them, he said quietly. Nobody moved. Lieutenant Danner forced a dry laugh. This is still an active municipal operation. The older man looked at him without emotion. You disabled a federal relay during a protected chain review. Silence spread instantly through the room. Officer Harris stepped backward. Miller swallowed hard. Eli stared at Naomi like he finally saw hope for the first time all night. Danner pointed toward the dead television screen. That footage was manipulated. Then you should have no problem replaying it. The older man nodded once toward a federal technician entering behind him. A portable monitor opened on the kitchen counter. Bright screen glow cut through the dark house. Naomi stayed silent near the hallway wall, wrists still restrained. She did not look relieved. That unsettled everyone more. The technician plugged directly into the damaged bodycam server. Red text flashed across the monitor. Recovering archived segments. Somebody in the crowd outside whispered, "Oh my God." Danner immediately stepped forward. Those files are sealed under local jurisdiction. Not anymore, the federal officer answered. Sharp. Controlled. You crossed into national oversight the moment protected credentials appeared in your report. Naomi finally spoke. Soft voice. Eli should sit down. Even now, she protected the child before herself. Mrs. Brooks guided Eli gently toward the couch. The boy never took his eyes off Naomi. On the monitor, frozen footage appeared frame by frame. Naomi standing calmly on her porch hours earlier. Hands visible. No aggression. No threat. Danner's earlier report already collapsing in silence. One officer near the door muttered under his breath, "That is not what dispatch said." Danner snapped instantly. Because you do not have full context. But his voice cracked slightly now. First crack. First fear. Then the technician paused the video suddenly. Sir. Everyone looked at the screen. Zoomed into Naomi's faded jacket pocket was a partially visible patch beneath the fabric. Not police. Not military rank exactly. Something classified looking. Covered fast again by static. The room held its breath. Danner stepped in front of the monitor immediately. Coincidence. Old surplus gear. Naomi lowered her eyes slightly. Said nothing. That silence hit harder than any argument. Harris slowly looked from Naomi to Danner. Lieutenant, why did dispatch mark her address with restricted clearance? Danner ignored him. Turn that screen off. Nobody obeyed. Outside, more neighbors gathered under umbrellas now. Not mocking anymore. Watching. Waiting. The federal officer finally walked closer to Naomi. He studied the restraint marks on her wrists for a long second before speaking quietly enough that only nearby officers heard him. Who authorized physical detention? Danner answered too quickly. I did. Another silence. Heavy this time. The federal officer's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Noted. The technician clicked another recovered file. Audio only at first. Static. Then Danner's voice filled the house again. Pentagon people do not live in places like this. A woman outside gasped softly. Miller closed his eyes briefly. Danner looked ready to explode. Context matters. Naomi finally lifted her head toward him. Calm. Controlled. Truth matters more. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. The room had changed now. You could feel it. If you were standing there, who do you think would panic first when the full truth finally appeared? Danner slammed his palm onto the counter suddenly. Enough. She still has not proven who she is. The federal officer answered without looking away from the monitor. That concern is disappearing rapidly. The technician opened another protected folder. This one required dual authentication. A long encrypted code began loading across the screen. Naomi's expression changed for the first time all night. Small reaction. Barely visible. But the older federal officer noticed it immediately. You recognize the authorization tree, he said quietly. Naomi gave no answer. Eli looked confused now. Naomi, what is happening? Before she could respond, Danner lunged toward the monitor cable. Harris grabbed his wrist first. Hard. The entire room froze again. Harris stared directly at his superior. Sir, stop making this worse. Complete silence. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. The technician inserted the second clearance key. New files began unfolding rapidly across the screen. Mission timestamps. Classified routing numbers. Restricted chain approvals. One line remained blurred by loading encryption. Name, N. Carter. Status, active, data pending. Danner's face lost all color. The federal officer slowly picked up a sealed folder from the evidence box Naomi had protected all night. He placed it carefully onto the kitchen table in front of everyone. Then he looked around the room once. At the officers. At the neighbors recording through the doorway. At Naomi standing silently with cuffs still on her wrists. Finally, he rested one hand on the folder seal and said, before you judge her any further, watch this. The federal officer broke the seal slowly. Every eye in the room followed the movement. Rain still tapped against the windows, but inside Naomi Carter's house, nobody breathed loudly enough to hear it. The folder opened onto a thick black credential wallet stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. Lieutenant Danner immediately stepped forward. That could be fake. The older man ignored him completely. He placed the credential onto the kitchen table beneath the bright monitor light. The room froze. Clearance markings. Federal insignia. Active command authorization. Then the final line became visible. Dr. Naomi Carter, Senior Cyber Defense Command Authority, Pentagon Strategic Response Division. Mrs. Brooks covered her mouth. Harris whispered, "Dear God." Eli stared at Naomi like he no longer recognized the woman who made him grilled cheese sandwiches 3 nights a week. Danner laughed once. Too sharp. Too forced. Cyber desk people do not outrank city command. The federal officer finally looked directly at him. She oversees national infrastructure breach containment. Silence. Including Federal Emergency Response Authority above municipal executive offices. Another officer slowly lowered his phone. Someone outside whispered, "The mayor." The older man nodded once. "Yes. She outranks your mayor." The words landed like a physical shockwave. Danner's face drained completely now. Naomi still stood quietly beside the hallway wall, wrists red from the cuffs. She did not smile. She did not step forward dramatically. She only looked tired. The technician restored the final body cam segment. Video filled the screen. Naomi standing calmly on her porch earlier that night. Hands visible. Voice steady. "Lieutenant, your officers are violating federal containment protocol." Danner shoved her against the railing before she could finish speaking. Gasps filled the room immediately. Harris looked sick. Another recovered angle appeared from a second officer's camera. Danner leaning close enough to whisper, "Nobody important lives in this neighborhood." Mrs. Brooks sat down hard in the kitchen chair. Eli looked furious now. "You lied." Danner snapped instantly. She never identified herself. Naomi finally spoke. Quiet. Controlled. "You never let me." Nobody answered. The federal officer pulled another document from the folder. Signed escalation reports. Threat notices. Emergency network blackout warnings. Naomi's signature appeared across all of them. Not administrative paperwork. National level crisis command authorization. Harris shook his head slowly. She was trying to stop the relay seizure. "Correct," the older man answered. "Your lieutenant interrupted an active federal cyber defense operation." Danner pointed wildly toward the screen. "I thought she hacked the city system." The technician rotated the monitor. Another file appeared. Time stamped. Recorded dispatch edits. Manual evidence suppression. Officer deletion requests. Every change traced directly back to Lieutenant Danner's credentials. Complete silence. One officer stepped backward instinctively. Another removed his own body cam slowly like it suddenly weighed too much. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Not in victory. In disappointment. "You buried the footage," Harris said softly. Danner tried again. "I was protecting the department." "No," Naomi answered calmly. "You were protecting yourself." Nobody moved after that. The federal officer finally nodded toward Naomi's cuffs. Harris removed them carefully. His hands shook. The metallic click echoed through the room louder than shouting ever could. Red marks circled Naomi's wrists under the kitchen light. Eli stepped closer immediately. Naomi rested one hand lightly on his shoulder before looking toward the officers again. No anger. No revenge in her face. Just exhaustion. "The relay breach tonight exposed 3 military families overseas," she said quietly. "I asked for cooperation. Instead, your officers surrounded a child's home with rifles and cameras." Danner opened his mouth again. "I did not know who you were." Naomi looked directly at him for the first time since the raid began. "You should not need a Pentagon title to treat someone with dignity." Nobody could look away from her now. Phones lowered completely. The neighbors outside stopped recording. One officer near the doorway quietly removed the police tape from the front entrance. The federal technician loaded one final document onto the screen. Internal Affairs Notification. Federal Oversight Transfer. Emergency Suspension Order pending confirmation. Danner saw it instantly. Panic finally replaced arrogance. "You cannot do this without review." The older man answered coldly. The review already happened. Another black SUV pulled up outside. More officials stepped out carrying sealed cases. One wore internal affairs credentials. Another carried federal legal authorization folders. Danner looked around desperately now, but nobody stepped beside him anymore. Not Harris. Not Miller. Not even the officers who followed him into Naomi's home. Eli looked up at Naomi quietly. You were trying to protect everybody the whole time. Naomi looked down at the frightened boy and nodded once. That was always the job. The federal officer closed the folder slowly, then turned toward Danner. Lieutenant, he said evenly, would you like to explain why you erased evidence against a Pentagon command officer before federal investigators ask you under oath? Nobody answered the federal officer's question. Lieutenant Danner stood frozen beside the kitchen counter while rainwater slid down the windows behind him. The silence felt heavier now because everyone finally understood what they had witnessed. Not confusion. Not misunderstanding. Abuse of power. Officer Harris slowly reached toward Danner's shoulder. Sir, Danner jerked away immediately. Do not touch me. But his voice had lost all authority. The internal affairs supervisor stepped forward with a thin black case under his arm. Calm. Precise. Lieutenant Marcus Danner, he said evenly, you are being placed under immediate administrative suspension pending federal investigation into evidence tampering, unlawful detention, procedural misconduct, and obstruction of a protected federal operation. The words hit the room one by one. Every officer heard them. Every neighbor outside heard them too. Danner laughed weakly. This is political. Nobody joined him. The internal affairs supervisor extended his hand. Badge. Danner hesitated. That hesitation told the room everything. Harris lowered his eyes. Miller stepped backward toward the doorway. Naomi watched quietly from across the room, one hand resting near Eli's shoulder. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. Danner finally unclipped his badge with shaking fingers. The metallic sound against the table landed harder than a gunshot ever could. Mrs. Brooks quietly wiped tears from her face. Someone outside whispered, they were wrong about her. The federal technician restored the final chain logs onto the monitor. Every deleted body cam segment. Every altered dispatch note. Every unauthorized override. Danner's name stamped across all of it. Complete proof. One officer near the back removed his own hat slowly. You told us she was dangerous, he muttered. Danner snapped instantly. I was protecting this city. Naomi finally spoke again. Calm voice. You were protecting your pride. Silence. Harris looked at Naomi carefully now. Not with suspicion anymore. With shame. Ma'am, we should have listened. Naomi nodded once. You should have listened before you saw my rank. Nobody in the room could look away from her after that. The federal officer closed the classified folder slowly. Dr. Carter requested cooperation 3 times tonight before escalation. He looked directly at the officers. Your department answered with force instead. Eli stood quietly beside Naomi, staring at the removed badge on the table. So they came here because they thought nobody important would defend us? Naomi looked down at him softly. That happens to many people every day. The room went still again. Because everybody knew she was right. Outside, neighbors who had filmed the raid earlier slowly lowered their phones completely now. A woman across the street deleted a video from her screen without saying a word. Another officer quietly removed the police tape from Naomi's porch railing. Symbolic. Small. But everyone noticed it. The internal affairs supervisor opened another folder. Lieutenant Danner's command authority is revoked effective immediately. Harris inhaled sharply. Danner looked desperate now. You are ruining my career over one mistake. Naomi answered before anyone else could. 30 officers surrounded a child's home tonight. No anger in her voice. That made it worse. That was not one mistake. Danner looked around for support one last time. Nobody stepped forward. Not a single officer. Not even the crowd outside. The federal officer then turned toward Naomi carefully. Dr. Carter, Pentagon Command has formally requested your transfer to a protected residence until the investigation concludes. Naomi glanced around her damaged living room. Broken drawer. Muddy floor. Torn family photo frame near the couch. Eli watching her silently. No, she answered softly. We stay. The older man studied her for a second before nodding once. Respect. Genuine respect this time. Harris cleared his throat quietly. Ma'am, your federal credentials were restored to active command status 20 minutes ago. The technician rotated the screen toward her. System status, Dr. Naomi Carter, clearance verified, authority reinstated. Eli smiled for the first time all night. Small. Careful. Naomi touched the screen lightly, then looked back toward the officers still standing in her house. Do better for the next person, she said quietly. Even if they do not have a Pentagon file. Nobody answered because there was nothing left to argue with. The Internal Affairs supervisor collected Danner's badge and sealed it into an evidence pouch. Final. Permanent. Outside, dawn light barely started creeping into the wet street. The storm was finally weakening. Mrs. Brooks stepped closer and gently handed Naomi the cracked family photo frame from the floor. Naomi held it carefully in both hands. The glass was broken. But the picture inside survived. Eli looked up at her softly. What happens now? Naomi stared at the damaged frame for a long moment before answering. Now we decide what kind of people this city becomes after tonight. And near the doorway, the federal officer quietly held out a new access card embossed with Pentagon authorization seals, waiting for Naomi to decide whether she was finally ready to walk through a different door. Morning sunlight spilled softly across Naomi Carter's porch 3 weeks later. The police tape was gone. The broken railing had been repaired. Fresh flowers sat beside the front steps where muddy boots once crushed the garden during the raid. Across the street, neighbors who once watched silently now nodded to her with quiet respect when she walked outside. Nobody stared anymore. Nobody whispered. Eli opened the front door holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate carefully in both hands. I still think you should let me carry the important folders, he said with a small grin. Naomi smiled faintly for the first time in days. You are still working on cereal without spilling it. Eli laughed softly. The sound felt different now. Lighter. Inside the house, the old cracked family photo frame rested on the bookshelf. The glass had been replaced, but Naomi kept the small scratch along the corner untouched. A reminder. Not of humiliation. Of survival. Her Pentagon access badge now sat beside it openly instead of hidden in a drawer. Not as a weapon. As proof she no longer needed to shrink herself to be treated like human. A black SUV pulled quietly into the street. The same federal officer stepped out carrying a thin folder. No emergency lights this time. No weapons. Just morning air and calm footsteps. Dr. Carter, he greeted gently. Naomi invited him inside. Eli instantly noticed the gold seal on the folder. More bad news. The older man shook his head. Actually, the opposite. He handed Naomi the documents. Formal apology from the city council. Federal commendation reinstatement. Community Protection Initiative approval. Naomi read silently for a long moment. One line stood out most. The Carter Protocol, mandatory de-escalation training for all municipal officers during civilian contact operations. Eli looked confused. They named it after you? Naomi stared at the paper quietly. Then she folded it carefully. No, she said softly. They named it after what should have happened from the beginning. Down the street, Officer Harris approached slowly in plain clothes. No badge visible now. Just nervous hands and tired eyes. He stopped near the porch steps. Ma'am. I know sorry is not enough. Naomi looked at him calmly. Harris swallowed hard. But I wanted to return this personally. He held out the small evidence pouch containing her old porch key and the worn photo officers knocked to the floor that night. Naomi accepted them gently. Thank you for bringing them back. Harris nodded once. My daughter saw the footage online. His voice cracked slightly. She asked me why nobody listened to you sooner. Silence settled for a second. Honest silence this time. Naomi looked toward the quiet street before answering softly. Then teach her to listen before fear tells her who matters. Harris lowered his head. I will. Across town, Lieutenant Danner's investigation continued behind closed doors. Nobody celebrated it publicly. Nobody needed to. The system had already spoken. What mattered more was what changed afterward. New review policies. Mandatory body cam transparency. Civilian protection oversight. Officers required to complete bias response training before active field command. Small changes. Human changes. Real ones. Later that afternoon, Naomi stood inside a crowded community center beside folding tables stacked with donated school supplies and laptops. Pentagon officials funded the program quietly after the incident. Not for publicity. For repair. A nervous teenage girl lingered near the back wall wearing faded clothes and avoiding eye contact. Naomi recognized the posture immediately. The girl whispered, I do not think I belong here. Naomi walked over slowly and placed a laptop gently into her hands. Neither did I once, she answered. Walk in anyway. The girl smiled carefully. First time all day. Eli watched nearby, proud and silent. Mrs. Brooks sat in the front row clapping softly while children filled out scholarship forms beneath warm afternoon light. No cameras. No shouting. Just dignity returning piece by piece. Before sunset, Naomi stepped outside the community center alone for a moment. She held the repaired family photo frame under one arm and her Pentagon badge in the other hand. Across the street, a patrol officer stopped traffic so an elderly man with a cane could cross safely. Small gesture. But Naomi noticed it. The world had not transformed overnight. Pain did not disappear because truth finally won. But something shifted. Something human. Eli pushed open the center doors behind her. They are waiting for you inside. Naomi glanced once at the sky glowing gold above the city that once treated her like a threat. Then she walked back through the open doors with her head high, the badge no longer hidden, the old photo finally restored, and the quiet understanding that dignity had returned not only to her home, but to everyone brave enough to believe that power should never decide who deserves respect.